Daniel Whitmore thought humiliating Emily Carter in front of the entire executive board would prove who truly belonged in the room. But less than 48 hours later, the billion-dollar company he mocked her inside of would stand inches away from total collapse. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel and support our work, because stories like this take time to create, and your support helps us bring more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and unexpected brilliance to life. The 22nd floor of Hartwell Global Logistics overlooked downtown Chicago through massive glass windows streaked with cold November rain. Inside the executive conference room, polished marble floors reflected the glow of giant digital screens, flashing alarming numbers in bright red. Delayed shipments, failed routes, millions of dollars bleeding by the hour. Tension hung in the air thicker than the smell of burnt coffee and expensive cologne. Senior executives shifted nervously in leather chairs, while assistants whispered updates under their breath. The company's largest distribution network had begun failing across 3 states, and no one inside the room seemed capable of stopping it. At the far end of the conference table sat Daniel Whitmore, regional manager of Midwest operations, his tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, silver cufflinks glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. At 46, Daniel carried the polished confidence of a man who had spent years believing he was the smartest person in every room he entered. He spoke loudly, interrupted often, and never tolerated disagreement from employees beneath his rank, especially not from someone like Emily Carter. Emily sat quietly near the back wall beside 2 junior analysts who barely acknowledged her existence. Her gray cardigan looked almost invisible against the cold corporate interior, and her simple notebook rested neatly beside an outdated company laptop with worn edges. At 38, Emily had spent nearly 4 years inside Hartwell Global without attracting attention. Most executives couldn't have picked her out of a lineup. That was exactly how Daniel preferred it. "We are not dealing with a routing issue," Daniel announced sharply, pointing at the massive supply chain map glowing behind him. "We're dealing with temporary software instability. The consultants already confirmed it." Several executives nodded quickly. No one wanted to challenge him publicly. Emily studied the screen silently, her eyes narrowing slightly as another route cluster turned red. She had seen the pattern nearly 6 hours earlier while reviewing overnight logistics reports. It wasn't temporary instability. It was a forecasting loop failure buried deep inside the company's automated routing system. If the wrong sequence triggered nationwide, Hartwell Global could lose contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars before the weekend. Emily inhaled slowly before speaking. "The routing AI is overcorrecting shipment density," she said carefully. Her voice was soft but steady enough to cut through the room's nervous murmurs. "If we temporarily switch to the backup distribution protocol, we can stabilize the network before the loop spreads." Silence fell for half a second. Then Daniel laughed, not a polite laugh. A sharp, dismissive laugh that bounced off the glass walls of the conference room. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable smiles. One manager looked down at the table to avoid eye contact. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "You think you solved a billion-dollar logistics crisis from a cubicle?" he asked. A few people chuckled nervously. Emily remained still. "I'm saying the pattern matches a recursive overload sequence," she replied calmly. Daniel smirked. "And I'm saying this conversation is why analysts don't run multinational corporations." More laughter followed this time, louder now. Someone near the center of the table muttered, "Unbelievable." Daniel clicked his remote, dismissing her data from the screen entirely. "Stick to spreadsheets, Emily," he said coldly. "This is executive-level strategy." The room echoed with quiet laughter, but Emily never lowered her eyes. She simply looked back at the glowing red routes spreading across the country and realized something nobody else in that room understood yet. The collapse had already started. The laughter inside the executive conference room faded quickly once the meeting ended, but Emily Carter carried every word with her, as she stepped back into the cold, fluorescent maze of Hartwell Global's operations floor. Rows of gray cubicles stretched beneath humming ceiling lights, while hundreds of shipment alerts flashed endlessly across digital monitors mounted on the walls. Outside the towering windows, Chicago traffic crawled through sheets of freezing rain. But inside the building, another kind of storm was quietly building beneath the company's polished image. Emily returned to her desk without speaking to anyone. That was normal for her. Over the years, she had learned how invisible people became once others decided they were ordinary. Her cubicle sat near the back corner beside the supply analytics division, far away from executive offices lined with glass walls and imported furniture. While senior managers attended expensive strategy dinners downtown, Emily spent most evenings correcting shipment discrepancies and rebuilding damaged spreadsheets that other departments ignored. A small framed photograph of her mother rested beside her monitor, next to a neatly packed lunch container she rarely had time to finish. There was nothing about Emily Carter that looked extraordinary. Her clothes were simple. Her hair remained tied back in the same practical style every day. She never raised her voice during meetings, never competed for attention, and never participated in office gossip. New employees often assumed she worked in administrative support rather than systems analysis. Daniel Whitmore had once referred to her as background furniture during a private management call, not realizing another analyst had overheard him. The comments spread quietly through the department afterward. Emily never reacted when she heard about it. She simply continued working. What nobody inside Hartwell Global understood was that Emily had not always lived this way. 15 years earlier, before family illness reshaped her life, she had been one of the youngest systems architects at a major logistics technology firm in Seattle. Her forecasting models had once optimized freight operations across nearly half the West Coast. Industry executives used to fly her across the country for emergency consultations during supply chain failures. But after her father passed away and her mother became seriously ill, Emily stepped away from corporate leadership entirely. Promotions disappeared. Professional connections faded. The industry moved on without her. And eventually, Emily allowed people to underestimate her because it became easier than explaining who she used to be. Across the operations floor, voices suddenly rose near the executive offices. A shipment crisis in Indianapolis had now spread into Ohio distribution routes. Emily glanced quietly at the newest data streaming across her monitor and immediately felt her stomach tighten. The recursive overload sequence was accelerating faster than she predicted. Entire route clusters were beginning to duplicate themselves automatically inside the forecasting system, creating false demand spikes every 6 minutes. Millions of dollars in inventory were already moving toward the wrong warehouses. Emily opened 3 separate diagnostic windows and reviewed the numbers carefully. The pattern was unmistakable now. Her proposed backup routing protocol could still stop the damage, but the window to contain it was shrinking by the hour. Nearby employees whispered nervously while pretending to work. One junior analyst leaned over another cubicle and muttered, "Daniel says the consultants have everything under control." Emily stared silently at the glowing screen in front of her. She knew they did not. Somewhere high above the operations floor, executives still believed confidence could overpower reality. But data did not care about titles, tailored suits, or executive authority. Numbers only told the truth, and the truth spreading across Emily's monitor looked catastrophic. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere inside Hartwell Global had changed completely. The polished confidence that usually filled the corporate headquarters was gone, replaced by restless silence and the constant vibration of emergency notifications echoing through every department. Large digital displays across the operations floor now flashed shipment delays in 7 states, and customer complaints were arriving faster than support teams could answer them. Entire warehouse schedules had begun collapsing into chaos. Trucks waited at loading docks for routes that no longer existed, while high-priority medical shipments sat stranded in the wrong distribution centers hundreds of miles away. Employees who once moved casually through the building now walked quickly with lowered voices and tense expressions. Even the elevators felt quieter. Emily Carter sat at her cubicle reviewing updated logistics reports, while cold coffee rested untouched beside her keyboard. The recursive forecasting failure had evolved exactly as she predicted. Every automated correction the system attempted only multiplied the disruption further. She watched route chains duplicate themselves across the Midwest map in expanding clusters of red, and with every passing hour, the company moved closer to a financial disaster large enough to make national headlines. Still, nobody from executive leadership had contacted her. Daniel Whitmore remained fully committed to protecting his authority. Just after 9 o'clock, a message appeared on every employee screen announcing another mandatory executive briefing. Workers gathered quietly around mounted monitors throughout the operations floor, while senior leadership appeared live from the glass conference room upstairs. Daniel stood at the center of the room with forced composure, his tie slightly loosened now, dark circles visible beneath his eyes for the first time. Behind him, consultants in expensive suits shuffled through digital reports while trying to avoid eye contact with one another. "The situation is under control," Daniel announced firmly. "Temporary disruptions are expected during large-scale routing adjustments." Emily looked at the numbers updating live beside his presentation and immediately realized he was not telling the truth. The company had already lost nearly $40 million overnight. One more failed cycle would trigger automatic contract penalties with 3 major retail partners. Daniel continued speaking with the same polished arrogance that had carried him through years of corporate success. "We are implementing advanced stabilization protocols recommended by top industry consultants." Emily closed her eyes briefly. The consultants were repeating the same corrective sequence that caused the overload in the first place. They were feeding gasoline into a fire they still could not see. Nearby employees exchanged worried glances. A young analyst named Trevor leaned toward Emily carefully and whispered, "You were right, we're not you." Emily kept her eyes on the monitor. "It is worse than yesterday," she replied quietly. Upstairs inside the executive conference room, tension finally began breaking through Daniel's controlled image. One senior vice president interrupted him mid-presentation. "Why are Ohio and Indiana still duplicating route traffic every 6 minutes?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Our consultants are handling the issue." "Handling it?" Another executive snapped. "We lost 2 pharmaceutical contracts before sunrise." The room fell silent. Daniel glanced briefly toward the operations floor below through the glass wall, his expression hardening the moment he spotted Emily seated quietly at her desk. Something about her calmness unsettled him now. Most employees looked panicked. Emily did not. She simply continued working as though she already knew exactly how this story would end. Daniel turned sharply back toward the room. "I do not want unauthorized employees spreading theories through the company," he said coldly. "This stays within executive management." The statement was directed at no one officially, but everyone understood who he meant. A few moments later, Emily's inbox chimed softly. A new internal notice appeared across her screen. Effective immediately, Emily Carter was removed from all emergency logistics discussions and reassigned to overnight data cleanup support. No explanation, no meeting, no conversation, just corporate punishment delivered quietly through software. Around her, coworkers avoided looking in her direction. Fear traveled quickly inside billion-dollar companies. Emily read the notice once, then calmly returned to the glowing red shipment map on her monitor. Because while executives protected their reputations, she was beginning to understand something terrifying. Hartwell Global was no longer fighting a disruption. It was fighting the beginning of a collapse. Thursday arrived with a gray sky hanging low over Chicago, and inside Hartwell Global, Exhaustion had already begun settling into the walls like smoke after a fire. Employees moved through the building carrying laptops, coffee cups, and growing anxiety, while shipment alerts continued flashing nonstop across giant overhead monitors. Every department now felt the pressure. Customer service teams were overwhelmed with angry calls. Warehouse supervisors demanded answers nobody could provide. Delivery forecasts changed by the minute as the automated routing system spiraled further out of control. Somewhere deep inside the company servers, the recursive overload sequence continued multiplying itself with ruthless precision. And still, the executives refused to admit the truth. Emily Carter sat alone in the overnight support section, reviewing live data feeds under dim fluorescent lights. Her reassignment had effectively erased her from strategic discussions entirely. No more executive meetings. No more access to emergency planning sessions. Just endless cleanup reports and damaged shipment records dumped into her queue by departments too overwhelmed to handle them. The move was intentional. Daniel Whitmore wanted her invisible again, but invisibility had always given Emily something powerful: freedom to observe. Around midnight, the operations floor had mostly emptied. Cleaning crews rolled carts quietly between dark cubicles while the city lights shimmered against the rain-covered windows 40 stories above the streets below. Emily stared at the massive logistics dashboard glowing across her monitor, her fingers resting motionless on the keyboard. The collapse pattern had accelerated beyond anything she predicted. Entire distribution chains were now rerouting themselves into impossible loops, creating phantom deliveries that consumed fuel, warehouse capacity, and labor hours simultaneously. The consultants upstairs still believed the issue could be stabilized through incremental corrections. Emily knew better. The system itself no longer trusted its own forecasting logic. It was feeding panic into panic. A soft voice interrupted the silence behind her. "You are still here?" Emily turned and saw Trevor standing nearby holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee. The young analyst looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his expression uneasy. Emily accepted the cup politely. "Someone should monitor the damage," she replied quietly. Trevor hesitated before lowering his voice further. "People are saying the board of directors might replace Daniel by the weekend." Emily looked back toward the glowing monitor. "That will not stop the system failure." Trevor swallowed nervously. "Then what will?" For the first time all night, Emily paused before answering. "Shutting down the automated forecasting chain completely and rebuilding distribution routing manually for 72 hours. Trevor stared at her. "That would cost millions." Emily nodded once. "Not doing it will cost billions." The words settled heavily between them. Somewhere upstairs, muffled shouting echoed faintly through the ventilation system. Another emergency executive meeting had clearly turned hostile. Trevor leaned closer. "Why are they not listening to you?" Emily gave a faint smile without humor. "Because people in power rarely trust quiet voices during a crisis." At that exact moment, Daniel Whitmore stood inside the executive conference room, trying desperately to maintain control over a room that no longer believed him. Senior executives interrupted each other, while giant screens displayed plunging operational numbers in real time. One contract cancellation after another appeared across the board. A vice president slammed a folder onto the marble table. "We lost another national retailer 15 minutes ago." Daniel tightened his jaw. "The consultants are implementing revised stabilization protocols. Your consultants have burned through $23 million in 12 hours. Another executive snapped coldly. The room went silent again. Daniel felt the pressure closing around him now. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cold air conditioning. But pride is a dangerous thing inside powerful people. Instead of admitting failure, Daniel doubled down harder. "I will not have lower-level employees undermining executive authority with amateur theories," he said sharply. No one answered him this time. Because deep down, Everyone in that room had started wondering about the quiet woman downstairs who had warned them before the collapse began. And while executives fought to protect their titles, Emily Carter continued watching the disaster unfold line by line across her screen, already understanding something terrifying that the others still could not accept. Hartwell Global was running out of time. By Thursday afternoon, Hartwell Global no longer resembled the polished logistics empire it had once proudly presented to investors and clients. The atmosphere inside headquarters had become heavy with panic disguised as professionalism. Executives moved rapidly through glass corridors, carrying tablets filled with bad news, while emergency conference calls echoed behind closed office doors. On the operations floor, exhausted analysts stared at glowing shipment maps that looked more like spreading wildfires than distribution routes. Entire regions across the Midwest were now failing simultaneously. Trucks sat idle at loading centers waiting for instructions that changed every 20 minutes. Medical suppliers threatened legal action. National retailers suspended contracts. One major grocery chain announced it would temporarily move distribution to Hartwell's competitors before the weekend. The financial damage had already crossed $200 million by noon. And still, nobody inside executive leadership wanted to publicly admit the company was losing control. Emily Carter sat quietly at her cubicle reviewing updated route failures while rain hammered against the skyscraper windows outside. She had not slept in nearly 20 hours. Empty coffee cups surrounded her desk, and pages filled with handwritten calculations covered the surface beside her keyboard. The deeper she analyzed the routing failures, the worse the reality became. The forecasting system was now consuming its own correction patterns faster than any automated safeguard could stop it. If the company did not manually sever the predictive routing chain soon, every distribution hub east of the Mississippi River could shut down within another day. Trevor approached her desk carefully, lowering his voice. "You need to see this." He handed her a printed internal report marked confidential. Emily scanned the first page silently. Her expression tightened almost immediately. "They activated dynamic acceleration routing," she said quietly. Trevor nodded nervously. "Daniel approved it an hour ago." Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. Dynamic acceleration routing was the worst possible decision they could have made. The system was already unstable. Increasing shipment speed and route recalculations would force the forecasting engine into complete recursive collapse. "They just shortened the company's survival window," Emily whispered. Across the building on the 22nd floor, another executive meeting had turned hostile. The polished confidence Daniel Whitmore once carried so easily was beginning to crack under pressure. His voice had become sharper now, less controlled, more defensive. "The acceleration protocol will stabilize throughput," he insisted while pacing beside the giant digital display. "It is a temporary measure." "Temporary?" One board member interrupted coldly. "We have lost 6 national accounts in 14 hours. Another executive slid a report across the marble table. "Our stock dropped 12% since opening." Silence followed. Daniel stared at the numbers, refusing to fully process them. Around the room, executives avoided looking at one another. Nobody wanted to say aloud what many were already thinking. The quiet analyst downstairs had warned them 2 days ago. One older board member finally spoke. Who was the employee who suggested shutting down the routing automation? Daniel's jaw tightened instantly. A junior analyst. Name. Daniel hesitated for half a second too long. Emily Carter. The room remained silent. One executive leaned back slowly in his chair. "And where is she now?" Daniel adjusted his cufflinks carefully before answering. "Handling overnight support assignments." Several people exchanged stunned glances. Nobody said the obvious truth aloud, but it settled over the room anyway like cold fog. The one employee who had correctly identified the crisis had been removed from the decision-making process entirely. Downstairs, Emily continued typing calmly while the company around her spiraled closer toward catastrophe. Nearby employees no longer ignored her now. Some watched her quietly from across the operations floor, almost as though they sensed she understood something nobody else could fix. Emily studied the latest route simulations one final time before slowly leaning back in her chair. The numbers no longer showed a possible collapse, they showed a countdown. And for the first time since the crisis began, fear finally appeared in her eyes. Thursday night settled over Chicago with freezing rain and sharp winds rattling against the towering glass walls of Hartwell Global headquarters. Most of the city had gone home hours ago, but inside the building, lights still burned across nearly every floor. Employees moved through the hallways carrying exhaustion on their faces, while emergency alerts continued flooding company systems faster than teams could respond. Somewhere in the distance, phones rang endlessly inside customer support divisions. Every department now understood the crisis was no longer temporary. Hartwell Global was bleeding money by the minute. On the overnight operations floor, only a handful of analysts remained at their desks. The usual corporate chatter had disappeared completely. Even the sound of keyboards felt quieter now, cautious almost, like people were afraid the wrong keystroke could make everything worse. Emily Carter sat alone beneath the pale glow of her monitor, studying route simulations that stretched across half the country. Her eyes looked tired, but focused. Calm in a way that made other employees uneasy, because panic usually spreads when nobody knows what to do. Emily frightened people because she clearly did. A soft buzz came from her phone. It was a voicemail notification from the assisted living center where her mother lived outside Milwaukee. Emily listened quietly while staring at the glowing logistics map in front of her. The nurse explained that her mother had asked about her again before going to sleep, worried because Emily had not called that evening. For a moment, Emily leaned back slowly in her chair and closed her eyes. The operations floor around her faded into silence as old memories surfaced without warning. Years earlier, another company, another crisis, another executive boardroom filled with people too proud to listen until disaster stood directly in front of them. Back then, Emily had been younger, sharper, louder. She remembered standing inside a Seattle technology firm at 2 o'clock in the morning, while terrified executives begged her to rebuild a collapsing freight network after weeks of ignoring her warnings. She remembered sleeping on office couches for 4 straight nights while engineers worked beside her under fluorescent lights. Most of all, she remembered the moment the company survived and how executives suddenly treated her like a genius after spending months dismissing her before the crisis began. The praise had felt empty even then, because people rarely respect quiet intelligence until they desperately need it. Emily opened her eyes again and looked back at the screen. The same pattern was repeating itself now inside Hartwell Global. Different building, different executives, same arrogance, same refusal to listen until the collapse became impossible to deny. Trevor approached carefully, holding another cup of stale vending machine coffee. "You should probably go home for a few hours," he said quietly. Emily shook her head. If the system reaches full recursive saturation overnight, the Eastern network could fail before sunrise. Trevor looked toward the glowing shipment maps covering the wall. Can it still be stopped? Emily remained silent for several seconds before answering. Yes. Trevor stared at her. Then why are we still sitting here? Emily's expression darkened slightly. Because nobody with authority has accepted reality yet. Upstairs on the executive floor, Daniel Whitmore sat alone inside the dark conference room, staring at collapsing financial projections spread across the massive digital display. His polished confidence had almost completely disappeared now. His tie hung loose around his collar, and untouched coffee sat cold beside stacks of emergency reports. For the first time in years, Daniel no longer looked like a powerful executive. He looked like a man slowly realizing control had slipped through his hands. Outside the conference room, board members whispered in tense conversations, while legal teams prepared contingency plans in case the company's largest contracts failed overnight. Daniel rubbed his forehead and stared at the latest system forecast. Losses projected by morning had now crossed $700 million. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then his phone vibrated. One short message from the chief executive officer appeared across the screen. Emergency board meeting. 6 o'clock. Find a solution. Daniel stared at the words without blinking, because deep down, he already understood the terrifying truth. The one person who knew how to stop the collapse was the same quiet woman he had humiliated and pushed aside. And somewhere downstairs, beneath cold fluorescent lights, Emily Carter was still working calmly, while the billion-dollar company around her drifted closer toward the edge. Friday morning arrived without sunlight. Thick gray clouds hung over downtown Chicago, while freezing rain streaked across the glass walls of Hartwell Global headquarters. Inside the building, the atmosphere had become almost unrecognizable. Employees whispered instead of speaking normally. Phones rang unanswered across several departments. Emergency alerts flashed nonstop on giant monitors, while exhausted analysts stared blankly at shipment maps glowing almost entirely red. Overnight losses had crossed $900 million. 3 national retailers had officially terminated their contracts before dawn. News outlets were beginning to report disruptions across the Midwest distribution network, and investors were demanding immediate explanations. Panic had finally reached the executive floor. At 6 o'clock sharp, the board of directors gathered inside the main conference room overlooking the city skyline. The polished marble table that once hosted confident quarterly celebrations now felt like a courtroom. Nobody touched the catered breakfast sitting untouched near the wall. The only sounds came from quiet rain against the windows and the low hum of financial projections updating in real time across giant screens. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room looking exhausted. His carefully managed corporate image had deteriorated overnight. His shirt sleeves were rolled unevenly, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Every executive inside the room knew the company was now hours away from a catastrophic operational shutdown. The chief executive officer, Richard Holloway, entered without speaking and placed a thick report on the table. $943 million, he said coldly. That is where we are this morning. Silence filled the room. Richard looked directly at Daniel. Do you have a solution? Daniel opened his mouth slightly before closing it again. For the first time in years, he had none. The silence stretched painfully across the room until one board member finally spoke. Bring in the analyst. Daniel looked up sharply. Excuse me? Emily Carter, the board member replied calmly. The woman who warned everyone before this started. No one argued, because at this point, pride had become a luxury the company could no longer afford. 10 minutes later, Emily stepped quietly into the executive conference room, carrying her old laptop and a thin stack of handwritten notes. Several executives straightened in their chairs immediately. Others looked uncomfortable remembering how completely they had dismissed her only days earlier. Daniel avoided eye contact entirely. Emily remained calm as she walked toward the center of the room. Her gray cardigan looked almost out of place beside million-dollar suits and polished executive watches, yet somehow she carried herself more steadily than anyone else present. Richard Holloway gestured toward the digital display. Can you stop this? Emily studied the glowing shipment maps for several silent seconds before answering. Yes. The single word changed the room instantly. Executives leaned forward. Daniel finally looked up. Emily placed her laptop onto the conference table and connected it to the main display. New routing diagrams appeared across the massive screens, replacing the chaotic red overload patterns currently consuming the system. Her voice remained calm, measured, almost quiet. The forecasting engine is trapped inside recursive correction loops, she explained. Every automated adjustment is creating new instability faster than the system can process. She typed several commands while continuing. The consultants treated the symptoms, they never isolated the source. Nobody interrupted her now, not even Daniel. Emily highlighted a sequence of route chains spreading across the Midwest. You must shut down predictive automation immediately, separate all dynamic acceleration protocols, and rebuild distribution manually for 72 hours. One executive blinked in disbelief. That would freeze half the network. Temporarily, Emily replied calmly, but it will stop total saturation. Richard Holloway narrowed his eyes. How certain are you? Emily looked directly at the screen filled with collapsing projections. 93%. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was not silence filled with mockery. It was the silence people fall into when confidence finally meets real competence. Daniel Whitmore stared at Emily without speaking as realization slowly settled across his face. The quiet woman he laughed at in front of everyone was now the only person standing between Hartwell Global and complete collapse. And for the first time since the crisis began, nobody in the room questioned her. The executive conference room remained completely silent for several seconds after Emily Carter finished explaining the recovery plan. Outside the towering windows, freezing rain swept across the Chicago skyline, while deep gray clouds darkened the city below. Inside Hartwell Global headquarters, nobody moved. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked their phones anymore. The only sound came from the low hum of overloaded servers vibrating through the walls. Richard Holloway slowly folded his hands together and looked directly at Emily. If we authorize this shutdown, he said carefully, how long until we see stabilization? Emily kept her eyes on the routing projections glowing across the massive digital display. Initial recovery should begin within 4 hours, she replied calmly. Full operational balance within 72. One board member leaned forward. And if we do nothing? Emily did not hesitate. The Eastern Network collapses before midnight. The room went still again. Daniel Whitmore stared down at the polished marble table in front of him, unable to hide the tension tightening across his face. Only 3 days earlier, he had laughed openly at the same woman, now calmly outlining the company's only path to survival. Richard Holloway finally spoke. Do it. The decision moved through the room like electricity. Senior executives immediately began making calls while emergency authorization requests flooded company systems. For the first time since the crisis began, the chaotic atmosphere inside the building shifted away from panic and toward focused urgency. Emily remained composed as she stepped toward the central operations console connected to every major Hartwell distribution center in the country. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard while system administrators gathered around her in silence. Daniel stood several feet away watching her work, but he no longer looked like the most powerful person in the room. Emily initiated the first shutdown sequence. Instantly, dozens of flashing red route chains disappeared from the main display. Several executives inhaled sharply. Manual routing teams are now isolated from predictive automation, Emily explained. The recursive loops cannot multiply anymore. She continued typing calmly while giant maps updated across the screens in real time. One by one, corrupted distribution chains began stabilizing. Shipment duplication errors slowed. Fuel allocation systems normalized. Warehouse congestion indicators gradually shifted from flashing red to yellow. Trevor stood near the back of the room, staring at the display with disbelief written across his face. "It is working," he whispered. Nobody answered him because everyone could already see it. 4 hours earlier, the company had been preparing for collapse. Now, for the first time in days, the numbers were moving in the right direction. A logistics supervisor from Indianapolis appeared on a live operations feed, his voice filled with relief. Distribution routes are stabilizing here. Another call arrived from Columbus, then Milwaukee, then Detroit. Across the giant digital wall, entire regions slowly transformed from chaos into order. The room watched in stunned silence as Emily rebuilt the company's operational backbone almost line by line. No dramatic speeches, no arrogance, no celebration, just calm precision. Richard Holloway looked toward Daniel without speaking. He did not need to. The humiliation already sat plainly across Daniel's face. His authority, his confidence, his polished corporate image had all collapsed under the weight of one undeniable truth. The quiet woman he dismissed understood the company better than everyone else in the room combined. One senior board member finally broke the silence. "Who exactly is Emily Carter?" Another executive quickly pulled up an archived personnel report. His expression changed almost immediately. "My God," he murmured softly. Richard turned toward him. "What?" The executive looked back at the room in disbelief. Before joining Hartwell, she designed emergency freight recovery systems for Pacific Meridian Technologies. Several people straightened in shock. Pacific Meridian was legendary within the logistics industry. Their recovery infrastructure models were still studied by major corporations across the country. The executive continued reading quietly. She led the Seattle containment rebuild during the Northwest shipping collapse 13 years ago. Daniel slowly looked back at Emily as realization fully settled across the room. The woman he treated like background furniture had once been one of the most respected systems strategists in the industry. Emily remained focused on the glowing screens while shipment routes stabilized across the country. She did not look proud. She did not look angry. She simply looked like someone doing the job nobody else could do. And as the final red warning indicators faded from the digital map, the room fell silent once again. But this time, the silence was not filled with mockery. It was filled with respect. By late Friday evening, the storm over Chicago had finally begun to fade. Rain still clung to the towering glass windows of Hartwell Global headquarters, but inside the building, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The giant digital shipment maps that had glowed red for nearly 3 days now pulsed mostly green across the country. Distribution routes stabilized one after another. Warehouse congestion steadily dropped. Delayed freight movement resumed across the Midwest, while exhausted employees stared at the screens, almost unable to believe what they were seeing. For the first time since the crisis began, the building felt quiet again. Not the silence of fear, the silence of survival. Emily Carter remained seated at the operations console, reviewing the final stabilization reports, while system administrators nearby exchanged relieved smiles. Some employees quietly thanked her as they passed. Others simply watched her with the kind of respect people reserve for someone they completely misjudged. Trevor leaned against a nearby desk and shook his head slowly. "You saved the company," he said softly. Emily continued typing for another moment before answering. "A lot of people worked hard." Trevor gave a faint laugh. "That is not what happened, and you know it." Emily said nothing, because she had never cared much about recognition. Around 8 o'clock, Richard Holloway entered the operations floor, accompanied by several board members. Conversations immediately stopped. Executives who normally remained isolated on the upper floors now walked carefully through rows of cubicles beneath fluorescent lights, seeing the overnight support division clearly for the first time. Richard approached Emily directly. "The board has completed its emergency review," he said calmly. Emily looked up from her monitor. Richard glanced briefly toward Daniel Whitmore, standing several feet behind him. The regional manager no longer carried the polished arrogance that once filled every room he entered. His shoulders looked heavier now, his expression subdued. "Effective immediately," Richard continued, "Daniel Whitmore has been removed from operational leadership pending formal review." The room remained silent. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly but did not argue, because there was nothing left to defend. Richard then turned back toward Emily. "The board would like to offer you the position of Senior Vice President of Systems Strategy." Several nearby employees exchanged stunned looks. It was one of the most powerful operational roles in the company. Emily remained quiet for several seconds before closing her laptop gently. "I appreciate the offer," she said calmly, "but I have one condition." Richard folded his arms. Name it. Emily glanced around the exhausted operations floor. Analysts who had worked through the night, support staff sleeping at their desks, warehouse coordinators still answering emergency calls, people nobody usually noticed until something broke. No layoffs, Emily said quietly. Not for the warehouse teams, not for overnight operations, not for support staff. Richard looked surprised. After everything that happened, that is your first concern? Emily nodded once. They kept the company running while leadership ignored the problem. The room fell completely silent again. Even Daniel Whitmore looked stunned by her answer, because power usually reveals character. And in that moment, Emily's character stood taller than every executive title surrounding her. Richard slowly extended his hand. Done. Emily shook it politely, but without triumph. She had not fought for revenge. She had fought because thousands of ordinary employees would have suffered if the company collapsed. An hour later, Emily stepped out of Hartwell Global headquarters into the cold Chicago night, carrying the same worn laptop bag she brought to work every day. The storm clouds had finally broken apart, and the city lights reflected across rain-covered streets below. Behind her, inside a billion-dollar skyscraper, executives were still discussing forecasts, recovery strategies, and shareholder confidence. But Emily walked quietly toward the parking garage without looking back. Because people like her rarely need applause to understand their worth. And somewhere high above the city, inside silent executive offices filled with polished marble and expensive glass, the people who once laughed at her had finally learned something success alone could never teach them. Respect does not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who stays calm when everything else falls apart.